Did you ever feel your heart accelerate when you hear a noise in the middle of the night, not knowing where it came from? Today we will explore reports so intense that you will rethink your next adventures. Before you dive into these stories of freezing the pimple, you subscribe to the channel and leave the like not to lose any details. Now, get ready. When I was younger, I spent the dawn in the house of a colleague. One night, my colleague, I will call Lucinda, already had dormant with tiredness, while another friend I will call Marisa, and we were awakening, chatting. We were discouraged and sleepless, so we decided to leave hidden. Looking at retrospect, I have no idea what our heads went through. Our head objective was simple. We would follow straight by road until we reached the river of the municipality. We left there, and there was no one else standing. The neighborhood was totally silent. We didn't have many plans. After arriving in Rio, the intention was to stay there for a while to talk about boys and perhaps even try a cigarette. And that's precisely what we did. When we arrived at the park near the river, we located an isolated space we sat on the balance and light a cigarette to share or notice the hours running. And we had been there for a long time when I noticed a middle-aged man at the entrance of the park, only observing. We noticed his presence because he also brought a cigarette, but when he began to approach, I got my stomach wrapped, muttered to Marisa that it didn't seem good thing and poked it to go out quickly. Immediately we started walking, hurrying without running so as not to show despair. We tried to pretend that we were only leaving normally. I kept looking on my shoulder to make sure he still accompanied, but he didn't come on our pitch. Instead, he entered a clear van parked nearby, and that made me more restless because it seemed that he was waiting. Our departure soon noticed that the van had started and followed. In the distance, it was not so close, but enough to leave me insecure. We walked for a period that seemed infinite, and I imagined that we should already be close to Lucinda. Suddenly, Marisa, who led the course, whispered that none of us knew the neighborhood well, and it was then that we realized that we had no idea where Lucinda's house was in correct direction. But everything now seemed strange. Every block that we folded into confused even more. We continued to wander through meaningless streets waiting to find something familiar. But the more we tried, worse. Everything I got thinking was the van that kept some distance. We knew we had done a great nonsense, and we tried to define what the next step would be. That for our surprise, we saw a silhouette known in the distance was Lucinda's father. He was still at the end of the street with a mixture of anger and relief. Stamped on the face, he held a flashlight and clearly sought us. We had no chance of justify before he practically led us back to the house. We stayed so terrified that we don't even think about arguing. We received the biggest scolding our lives, but honestly, I could only be grateful for being saved. By looking in retrospective, I do not stop imagining that there was an angel from God at that time. Happily, Lucinda woke up in the middle of the night, noted that we weren't worried, then decided to call your father. I think she noticed that we had been left for a long time because our blankets were already cold. Everything could have finished in a much worse way. The park man who followed us with the van never approached, but seemed to wait for some opportunity. I prefer not to imagine what would have happened if we were not found in time and kept wandering aimlessly. Van hovered at dawn. We understand the worst way that one should not play with. This kind of attitude sometimes still remember and reflects how close we get of something much more serious. In the 1990s, when I was in high school, I was very good with manual work and had functions as a demolition in construction, paving, and car repair. One of the services I had was for a subject that renovated in restaurants, bars, shops, and other points of commerce. I attended the school of day, obviously, and sometimes worked after classes or in the purposes. Weekend to this subject was not uncommon for me to drop me alone in a construction site with a list of charges to fulfill, above all demolition tasks. One morning of Saturday, he searched me for the service since I did not drive. Yet I had a license he used to take to the addresses and then left me there. Only almost never worked with the other teams of his because they were more specialized people. And I did the preliminary service so that the main group could start remodeling. Here begins crucial part of the report. I did not pay attention to the final destination because we were distracted. talking, I think, about cars or something like the journey. It took a long time, and when we arrived, I noticed that it was in the middle of nothing desert. We left the main highway and took smaller roads of 2 tracks for a long, excellent even. I had no not of where it was taken. A great water container, because it was all I would have. I removed the junk from the truck before he left for another work. He warned me that I would come to pick me up around 17 or 18 hours. I wanted to say that I needed to finish everything. There was always his way to say that would only pay me until that time, so I better conclude on time. I found this dynamic fair because we always had a good understanding of period and goals. As soon as he left, I was completely alone on the property. I entered the house and saw that there was almost no furniture. My mission was to remove what was left of furniture appliances, rip the floor from the kitchen and bathroom, and remove all the wood lining the walls. Was used to being alone, working even late at night, so it would be no problem. But there was something in that construction that made me uncomfortable. The place was old, dark, and the air smelled of moisture all over. The interior was a peculiar cold of those who shivered, the nape destroying what I needed to. My surprise, everything seemed to go out effort. I used a large sledgehammer in the kitchen and rocked the whole area, separating the rubble in less than an hour. I ended up wearing the entire big gallon water that my boss gave me to wash my hands and face from time to time. In the late afternoon, I had drunk my last drop and eaten everything I took without worrying. Because I expected being caught soon, I finished all my service and even scanned the place for the next team to work later that week. At that time of year, it did not make the extreme heat of the desert, but as always, as soon as the sun, it faded everything cool quickly. I wore a flannel shirt that I didn't hold the cold so much, and the night was advancing. My transport was late. Then all I could do was wait for it before popularization of cell phones, and there was no light, water, or telephone in the house. I climbed to the roof to see something distant. I saw some houses, but all dark. My first idea was to go to some neighbor to use the phone, but I didn't want to risk and lose the ride, mainly because I wasn't sure if anyone would be there, and there was no light on any of them. I thought a little about my exits. While the night swallowed everything, I could stand still with the little water that left, or wait until you lighten and then walk until any track of civilization. I chose to wait for the rescue to suddenly arrive. I realized that no one knew where I was, saved. My boss didn't know if he had told someone, or if my family would only miss my miss on Sunday night because they knew how much I would work, and didn't worry if I didn't come back. The darkness took over, and I had no flashlight or any way of fire, but the moonlight light appeared a little. The cold was strong outside, and I returned into the house that looked more dark now, almost empty around 8 p.m. Batteries of my small radio, which was my only source of light and sound, began to fail. I took an old chair and sat on room in the house, without doing absolutely nothing, to wait wind and some strange noises that presumed to be animals at a distance. I began to tremble with cold, and maybe my head started to fool me. I saw figures passing by, from side to side, inside and outside, and had the impression of hearing low voices. I thought I was going crazy, and I raised from the chair. I shouted, "There is someone there." And as soon as I did it, I heard something fall across the house. It was enough for that hideous house. So I went out, at least on the moonlight. I had a better view of surrounding, listened to sounds and via movements, but could not distinguish what they were. My tools near the house wall prepared for when my boss arrived. I ran to them and grabbed an iron bar ready to defend me from whatever was there. I had to walking in circles because my flannel was insufficient and the wind increased without ceasing. Then I could see there was no light in any corner. I didn't want to go back in fear of falling into the darkness, so I climbed the gate to see if you were going. In the head came every story that had already heard about people who disappeared in the desert and bodies buried. I heard rumors of macabre and disappeared groups. Unanswered alarmed me, and every shadow made my heart fire. I wasn't sure if anyone was in that house, but I was almost convinced that I heard steps inside. I crouched on the front porch to shelter myself from the wind, looking out the room window, waiting to see someone come up at any time there at 11 p.m. I looked at my watch and realized that the night would be long as well as everything. Since I darkened, I didn't know how it would endure more about 6 hours until the sunrise around midnight. I was incredibly alert, with fixed eyes on the mud road, expecting to any instant vehicle appeared and maybe saved myself. I remember looking distractedly backwards towards the house. For all those moments I still heard strange sounds, but tried to convince me that they were rodents or any bug of the bush. So I saw a shadow of someone going from the kitchen to the hallway. I got up in a jump and was backwards balcony, and in the process I stumbled amid the mound of rubble and fell off. I tried to get up, but I fell again, looking like something pushed. Or maybe it was just my imagination. Suddenly a clarity approached. While I was on the floor, I saw my boss standing before me with a flashlight, wanting to know that I was doing there. I was so relieved to see him that I didn't even feel angry. I just asked what happened, and he explained to me that there was a disagreement, thought that the other team would catch me, but they supposed it was he who would come. So no one appeared. He said he only discovered more afternoon when talking to the other in charge, and that's when they realized that I followed arrested in the middle of nowhere. My boss felt very bad and assured that he would pay me for extra period. I passed there. Taking myself home, I asked about the place, and I commented how much it seemed sinister. He said he didn't know. Nothing about the house, just about what we should demolish. I don't know if it was delirious, but the period I spent isolated there in that desert at night was the most terrifying of my life. The most bizarre detail is that I did not notice vehicle headlights coming. My only memory of being rescued was to notice my boss about me with the flashlight without knowing the sure what actually happened at dawn. But it was so frightening that after that, I always took reserve piles, a flashlight, and extra water. I have been doing trails for a while ago, and one night I went to walk in a route that I already knew and considered my favorite. He has fame of having amazing views, and my intention was just a simple night trip without much. It takes time, so I took almost nothing, just water and my insulator. As the night was running, the mood was cooling the sun, if it put it, and I knew that soon it would be all dark. I had planned to pass only the main trail, but opted for a shorter way that would supposedly take me back to the faster car. Had already done this shortcut on another occasion without problem, but this time he led me to an area that I did not recognize. The forest was more closed and the light of the day faded. I must have wrongly or made some misunderstood curve in the... I did not go into despair because I believed that I would still be able to locate myself, but as I advanced, I noticed that nothing seemed familiar to the way the path was badly away. Now, just a few signs indistinct on the floor that I could hardly accompany. My phone did not catch, and when I tried to ask for help, the warning of without service appeared, was already darkening, and I had no idea where I was. There that I saw an old shack on the horizon, appeared abandonment, as if it was unused for years, but at the same time did not seem to be falling apart. The door was ajar and there was no one inside, so I decided to enter. Even thinking kind of bizarre finding such a place, I had no better options. I thought I could use as shelter until dawn, when it would be simpler to see the forest. The cabin was tiny with old wood walls. There was spoiled furniture, a dusty bench, and some boxes scattered on the floor. Was no big deal, but it was preferable to stay outside in the darkness. I closed the door and I wrapped in a corner wearing my pillow backpack, lying on a rug to try at least a little comfort around midnight. I started listening to very weak noises, but that they seemed to come from the underground of the start shack that I supplied to be an animal that had lodged there. But over dawn, the noises became more intense. I heard scratches more vigorous and noise from something brushing near me. Intrigued, I tried to ignore, dozing and awakening without stopping. Everything mingled in an instant when abruptly heard steps, firm, approaching me. In the middle of the night, I felt a light push under me, as if someone was forcing a passage under the rug. Where I was lying down, I shouted, "There is someone there," by reflection, without knowing what else to do. Who went down? There was trying to open the door tightly. I got up, and in moments, I heard hasty steps inside the cabin, producing great noise. I was a little panicked that the person could come back, but also did not want to bolt the trail in that dark Sing the rest of the night, waiting for the sun to arrive in the early hours of the morning before leaving that place. I decided check the passage on the floor under the carpet, but was sealed and did not discover another input for the compartment. There should be a way out for some point, because who was probably used before but was well camouflaged. I returned to the trail easily in daylight, because it was much simpler to guide after a period. I arrived in the parking lot and immediately communicated what I found to the authorities. But when they asked me exact details from where I was able to inform, it was such a part away from the main path, I really couldn't say. I don't know if they came to look for the cabin and buy the secret span, or if they didn't even give me credit because they thought there was no reason to alarm. To this day, I wonder why someone would keep a secret. Space below an old wooden cabin on the forest crumb should be some kind of refuge for an end to the world, or someone completely unbalanced. One of my greatest scares occurred in one of my last years in camp that the church organized when I was minor. I was 14 years old. My partner Vinicius were away from ours cabana. After the touch of collecting, we had not planned to go far, only to get a quick ride around the surroundings to explore, and who knows how to cause us. We were bored because we stayed the whole week at camp doing the usual activities, type lake bath, hiking and nocturnal bonfires. But that night we wanted something differently. We do not realize how risky it would be until later. We left the cabin in silence, not to alert anyone, and we descended the way towards the forest behind the camp. The place was distant, without houses in a huge radius, and without posts of lighting, only trees and small buildings. We knew the region well, but we had never tried to walk through it without clarity. Walked a little, just talking and laughing. We thought we could return before someone noticed our absence, but when we tried to go back, we realized that the camp was strange. Somehow, the trail we followed seemed different, and the few hut lights were in weird points. The shadows of the trees, they looked thicker, as if they were closing upon us. Vinicius and I started to accelerate the step, but everything only complicated the more we tried back. More distant the camp seemed to be. The way was unrecognizable. More twisted and tight, was as if the kill was moving around us, trying to reverse the route. But it was useless. We were both tense. Vinicius insisted that we would continue to walk, and we would find the course. But I was not so sure. My imagination was full of sinister stories that we listened to at the bonfires at the beginning of the Tales season. People who disappeared, weird sounds in darkness and old legends. No one really puts faith in these tales, but still they goosebumps after a long time. We paused. The forest was dense and the moonlight, it was insufficient. There was a heavy silence, as if everything was holding the breath. That's when we heard a noise, distant remembered steps stepping on leaves and branches, but with a strange drag. We said nothing, but we knew we had to leave. We quickly walked now, full of adrenaline. We felt that we needed return before it was late. We finally realized one of the weak lights of camp cabins in the middle of the trees, and we run, almost falling into the roots and rocks of the ground in the pitch when we emerged from the woods, and we went back to the main area. We were in the fire region. We returned for our dormitory without commenting on anything we found that we left today. I am not clear about what happened in that woods that night, but I'm sure we both feel something very unusual. Weird feeling as if the forest tried to keep us there. The strangest part was that I used a watch, and according to him, we were out of 1 hour and a half, or maybe 2 hours, but when we returned to the cabin, we look at his watches there, and apparently we had disappeared only half an hour. We made explorations in the dark. It was a summer night when I decided to row in the Supreme Lake. The climate had been good all day, and I found that it would be interesting a night row before returning to the camp where I left my trailer. I rowed there, lots of times, so I wasn't worried. I knew the lake could get agitated, but on that time it seemed quiet. The sun went down behind the trees, and I still saw the coast. Then I kept following, but in the blink of eyes, the sky was orange, and the next instant, everything was dark. I didn't notice how much I walked away from the bank to be too late. The lights where I had launched my kayak no longer appeared. I only saw water and the night contour of the almost invisible coast on the moonlight. The margin did not seem the same. In the pitch I sent in circles looking for my camp, but not I could locate nowhere, did not know. If the light I saw was off, or if I was too far, I kept paddling, but carefully not to get away too much in a direction. If the opposite direction, did not calculate how long it was there. Maybe an hour, maybe more, but the more time was more. Brain preached me tricks. Each wave proved greater than the previous, and each wind pushed me more to the center of the lake. I needed to row with vigor to stay near the margin, and the nervousness only got worse. He was not so cold, was the dread that dominated me after what seemed infinite. Finally, I envisioned a light far away was a small point, and the first clarity that I saw since I was in the water, I advanced toward you with all the strength, and almost I cried with relief as it came out of the water. The light belonged to the house of an elderly couple who welcomed me and let me spend the night. I'm very grateful, so I was glad they didn't mind helping me. I found that I had picked up about 12 kilometers away from where my camp was. I had no idea how this happened, because I thought it was close to the same stretch, but probably headed for the contrary side. I spent more than 3 hours out there, ironically. In the next morning, the safest way to return to camp with my kayak was rowing back in daylight with guidelines of the elderly couple who guided me without problems. To this day, still refers to the Supreme Lake, but now I am more cautious and rarely leave during the night. A year ago, in the early winter, I went trail on a weekend at a national park near home. Would be in the last days of pleasant climate before cold time and snow, so I wanted to enjoy while an acquaintance was viable. Mine mentioned a trail that sought a lake and was not much sought after, so I decided to try it. But when I got there, I didn't find what I imagined. There was no license plate or marking, just a thin path extending through some trees. I followed a little, and although there was no signaling, seemed like a reasonably simple path to follow. But while advanced, noticed that few people passed there, almost did not exist marks on the ground, and the way was not well defined. But I was not scared. Yet the forest around the trail was very beautiful, full of animals and leaves falling. With the arrival of the new station after about 1 kilometer, I found something peculiar. Another shortcut that was lost in the woods. Original trail, but I had no idea why there is that other way. If this trail was already little used, the more I followed, the more these secondary shortcuts appeared in random directions, leading to parts that they seemed to have no destination. Was very strange. After about 3 hours walking, the main route just ended. There was no longer only an infinite sequence of trees and kills. It was then that out of nowhere I heard steps behind me. I looked and spotted a guy walking too far. He wore a torn coat without backpack and strangely walking the same trail, entering one of the parallel deviations. He seemed not to notice me. He was looking at the floor as he continued the way he moved, and his expression made me uncomfortable. So I took care not to be noticed. Watching him disappear in the woods was already getting late, so I decided to drop the idea of seeing the lake and return to the car. However, in a few minutes I came across a fork that I didn't remember seeing it so far. At the same time, I remembered that the main trail had ended abruptly, and that it probably meant that in some point I had taken the wrong route. I tried look at the floor to find my own footprints, but I didn't see no sign. So I heard those steps behind me again and looked to the distant forest. The same man was standing staring at me without, if it moves or just talking. Looking at me for a moment, I felt a shiver, and I decided to take any way to the opposite side to him. I hurried, looking back several times, but after some minutes, I lost the man in sight. I remained on that trail for more than an hour, worried so much for being lost as for the presence of the stranger. At one point I got out of the way. I leaned on a tree to breathe and drink water, not even past a minute, and I heard those. I kept myself where I was behind the trunk while the sound was stronger. Even the subject passed, almost brushing the tree where I hid it. It seemed so focused on the trail as someone who tried to find me, but there was no doubt in my head that he hunted, or at least tried. As soon as he walked away, I took advantage to run back the way. I came to the fork and choosing one of 2 other routes that they went in the direction where I calculated. My car was lucky I made the right choice, because I got Finding the way back, I drove most of the road totally terrified. All I can say is that this man was not simply making a trail, and for his behavior I bet that had terrible goals that narrowly not realized. About a year ago in early winter, I was at home on the summer holidays of college and decided to spend a weekend in the middle of the bush. My mother lives in the city in the same house where I grew up, but my father moved to a distant cottage near the forest, and I found it very quiet there, away from everything that gave me a sense of freedom. That summer I had the idea of camping a night in the woods behind my father's house. I already had the necessary equipment, and it was not the first time I settled tent, so I assumed it would be a fun and safe program. I didn't think of walking a lot, maybe about 30 minutes until I found a perfect place to set up camp. I left about 2 hours before dusk. I walked without music, just absorbing the environment and the sounds. Natural until it entered enough in the woods to assemble the camp. I prepared the tent, lit a fire, and I rested as the sun came down and the forest was quieter. A few hours later I went. Sleep intended to go back early, but when I wake up the next day, I thought it would be nice to be a little more. I made a small trail and sat near the tent. Unexpectedly, time ran, and when I realized the sun was already disappearing, I started to pack everything and prepare to go back. I walked between the trees, talking to yourself to spend time, but as the sun disappeared, I noticed that I was walking for a long time and did not recognize the surroundings. I stopped and looked everywhere, nothing familiar. There was no way, and it could be that I was following a slightly different course, but something was out of place after a minute. Watching, I found out that I had no idea where to go. If I was in the right direction, I would have found the house, or at least the road where it was sitting, with the sun almost settled, reaching some way. Just as I walked, the forest was denser and the lack of clarity increased. I examined each side looking for a point of reference, but darkness limited my vision to some 15 meters. Then I saw a little light flashing more front. I was excited and accelerated until I noticed an old house in the middle of the trees. Deduced that would be the residence of some neighbor of my father, or at least a place that would take me to a street. But coming nearby, I realized that there was nothing around, any road or other signs of life. It was more of a house than a house, but there was a lit lamp in lower floor window, so it didn't seem as unemployed around by the trees. But I saw no route or other buildings. I decided to hit there and ask for help for anyone to live there. Approached, and I heard a little before hitting. As soon as I touched the bell, I heard steps down a ladder and going to the side of the house, probably peering at me. Door vision, I shouted, "Hi, sorry, I'm lost." I could tell me the nearest street. I heard a silence, and then the door opened. There were 2 men there, appearing to be about 40, and so many years, with very expressions indefinable. One of them took a step further and looked at the tree line as if looking for anyone else. They were silent for a moment until one spoke. "We will help." You hesitated and said that I didn't need so much, just tell me where the road was, please. Made a strange guy. One of them questioned why I was there. I reported that I was camping and I got lost, but they looked like I was inventing. Then one of them came out as far as I was and was very next, checking the darkness around. When he moved, I could see the room behind him that had only a small lamp in the center of the floor, surrounded by nothing but dirt. I felt a chill, and I kept some distance, and suddenly their posture changed. The countenance was vacant and were analyzing me in silence before I could react. One of them threw yourself against me, trying to knock me down with luck. I got rid of the time and ran to the woods, listening to the footsteps of one of them behind me. However, I passed the trees, he stopped following me, and the lights of the house went out. I spent hours walking until finding a road and realized that I had gone many kilometers in the opposite direction. I told my father what happened, and he warned the police to check, but we were shocked to learn that the house was an abandoned old cottage for decades. Want those individuals to have a generator to illuminate what they were doing, but no one knows what planned. The way they behaved made it seem that they wanted to be noticed if they had made me get into that house. I don't know what occurred with me. I was returning to my hometown. After a working trip I made days ago, I refused the free airfare of round trip because I decided stay a little more to enjoy a short holiday. I'm inexperienced in long car routes, in the longer 10 hours with a break at the hotel, but this time it was almost 20 hours and I had only reserved a place to sleep, yet I did not think impossible because I had never done something like it, but I thought I could deal well. On the way out, everything went quietly. I went through municipalities and villages with many other vehicles apparently in the same direction, but as I advanced, the cities were disappearing and the cars also disappeared. The highway fields on one side and a dense forest on the other around 5 p.m. The light drizzle became a thunderstorm, such a strong rain that almost it made it impossible to see it. Seemed that the more I drove into the forest, the stronger the rain fell. I expected to stop before dusk, but it didn't happen. Now I saw myself centered on the highway, running very slowly, fearing skid, and end up in the bush. I continued in this terrible scenario for more than an hour after sunset, when I started to notice that the road seemed much more curved. Instead of the way began to get more and more into the woods, with trees so close that they blocked any visibility. After some time I felt restless. Strange situation for a highway, reduced and leaned against I took the phone to check the map, but there was no sign. I just remembered that I should stay on this highway the whole route. Maybe I was still on the right track, and it was just neuro. Or perhaps I had a curve wrong, because I was so concentrated trying to see through the rain without knowing which of the two hypotheses was true. I looked at the windows hoping to see a sign or point of reference, but all that was seen through the storm were trees and dark stretches beyond the headlights. Right after I stopped a couple of minutes, came a rear view light I saw in the mirror as I approached, making the curve and reaching the lights behind me. They were so intense that they kept me from seeing the car. Only the light reflected in the mirrors. I felt that diminished the speed. Until parking behind me, part of me was happy to receive help, but the other part imagined bad scenarios if it passed a whole minute with the car stopped there, linked headlights without movement until a door opened, still too strong to see details. But I managed to distinguish the silhouette of a man that came to my window. He wore a dark hood and didn't seem to cool the rain as he leaned the door while I lowered the glass just a few inches. He asked if I needed something and explained that I just needed to know where I was and if I was on the right highway. He threw me a weird look, then stared at the back seat, and I nodded by saying, "Yes, I can give you a strength. I'll get my cell phone." He returned in the direction of his car as I closed the glass to avoid the water. Had something uncomfortable in that exchange, but not. I knew how to say what was something was out of the tracks because he didn't know what he saw we were or if we were on the correct highway. I kept an eye on the mirrors until it disappears in the blinding light. But I noticed that it moved something inside the car for a moment before I went out walking toward me. But moments before I arrived at my window, saw that he held some object. I did not hesitate moment. He crouched with my rear tire and dug something there. I stepped on the accelerator, coming out the fastest I could realize. The man gets scared and retreat as I fired. I knew he could try to chase me, so I ran for several minutes, fearing to see the headlights on my fighter. But it didn't happen around 5 kilometers until it saw a junction with a station sign. I stopped and called the police, and soon I noticed that the man had nailed a screwdriver on my tire that was still hung aside. That was probably the reason I could get off before the tire pierced. If I had hesitated a second more, would have been jammed right there in the middle of the road and could never have been seen after that night.